Hello and welcome to Cutting Through the Green Noise, a webinar brought to you by ICAEW and MHA McIntyre Hudson. I'm Richard Spencer, Director of Sustainability at ICAEW, and I'm joined today by three wonderful panelists. Mark Lumsdon-Taylor, who is a partner at MHA McIntyre Hudson. He specialises in a range of activities: rural and food, healthcare and digital, and ESG. He has extensive experience also in further, higher and commercial education. He's passionate about sustainability and transforming business. Mark has won numerous awards for his work, including National Finance Director of the Year Award 2007, the National Accounting for Sustainability Award 2012, the National Business Finance Director for 2014, the Business Sector Award for 2016, and the Institute of Directors Blue Ribbon Award for Governance and Financial Excellence in 2018. We're also joined by Rich Hall, who is Head of Sustainability and Stakeholder Assurance at McIntyre Hudson, which he joined in September 2020 to lead the sustainability, corporate responsibility and climate change work there. Rich brings with him 15 years of experience and passion of leading successful sustainability and risk engagements. He has led major sustainability engagements from idea generation and inception through to successful implementation across advisory, reporting, assurance, and internal audit. In addition to his sustainability expertise, Richard has engagement leader experience and expertise across third-party assurance, contract assurance, and complex risk management across strategy, operations, and supply chain. And third, but by no means least, we have Chris Newnham, Joint Managing Director at Wilkin & Sons. He's been Joint Managing Director there since 2016, prior to which he was Farms Director. He's a Nuffield Scholar and has a particular interest in sustainable horticulture, in water conservation, in the application of technology, and also in employee owned businesses. He currently chairs the Awards Council for the Worshipful Company of Fruiterers and is an Honorary Fellow of Writtle University College. Welcome to our panelists. And so the flow of today is that we are going to hear first from Rich Hall, who's going to take us through some of the big issues. Then we're going to move to Mark Lumsdon-Taylor, who's going to kind of outline the so what for SMEs. And then we're going to be, fortunately, very lucky to hear thirdly from Chris, who's going to bring his experience of running a small, medium-sized business. So first, if we could go to you, Rich.
Yeah, thanks, Richard, and morning, everybody. If we could just move on to the next slide, please. I'm going to sort of talk about 6 key influences on business briefly this morning. And sort of starting at the top, one of the first things we'll see that's hitting business from the ESG agenda is increasing legislation, and that's coming at several different levels. So I'll start with the sort of reporting side of things. So at the moment, there's an increase in the requirement for reporting. We've seen things like streamlined energy and carbon reporting, which is into its 2nd year now. We've got task force for climate-related disclosures that are coming on board as well, for starting at the larger listeds, but eventually moving through to all large companies. And this is driving a much greater scrutiny as well. So we're seeing greater scrutiny across that. That's the reporting side. At an industrial level, we're seeing sort of some specific legislation coming in different industries. A good example is the stopping of the sale of petrol and diesel cars by 2030. We've got the future home standards that's coming in, which means that all new housing has to be net carbon zero by 2025 in the UK and 2024 in Scotland. And each industry has these types of key level legislation that's coming through. And then globally, we're seeing some fairly big decisions being made, whether it's the phasing out or the phasing down of coal, for instance. That was at COP26, but previously to that was announced at the G7 in terms of the stopping of the state sponsorship. So there is this increasing legislation that is driving a lot of change across ESG. The sort of second key tranche there is this notion of access to finance. And the finance industry have been very much at the forefront of what's happening around climate change of late. There's been a lot of focus on them themselves in terms of, have they got capital risks? Have they got stranded assets? Where are they investing, for instance? And they have been at the forefront of some of the standards that are coming through. We're also seeing an increasing use of ESG screening, which used to be the reserves of impact in investing and ESG portfolios, but now that's now right across the main markets, and being used regularly in deals, a full stop. And then we're also seeing this development of new financial products with potentially lower interest rates and longer term repayment terms. Again, access to finance is proving fundamental. The third one on there, the sort of wider stakeholder piece, this is everything from what's happening regarding planning regs, and as local councils have net carbon zero strategies, there is some kind of increase in there. It's also staff attraction. This is an incredibly important agenda for staff attraction, retention, and the common theme of increasing media attention and attention full stop. And obviously we're seeing quite a lot of NGO activity, particularly across climate, but across all forms of ESG. The sort of fourth one on there, the increasing media scrutiny. We've seen how much there's been around ESG at the moment. We've had COP26 from the climate side of things. The number of advocates that talk about climate change, and I've been involved in it for actually closer to 20 years now for sustainability and ESG, increases year on year. We've had Prince Charles, but there are many, many people, David Attenborough, the list increases on a daily basis. Greta Thunberg, whether you like her or you don't, she was Times Personality of the Year into a Time magazine Personality of the Year in 2020, and that's a really good indicator of just how much emphasis is being placed on ESG. And again, this notion that there's much greater scrutiny. And there's a real lookout. And one of the key themes that came out of COP26 was stopping the greenwash. So, getting to the bottom of what people are doing and making sure that it's absolutely right. Moving on to the sort of consumer preference, and this could be consumer preference, but it can also be direct business and supply chain pressure. So again, and particularly from the SME side of the business spectrum, this is really one of the key drivers. A lot of big OEMs, a lot of big national organisations have got things like net carbon zero targets. They have supply chain standards around labour. They're worried about modern slavery, etc., etc. So you are likely to find, if you're not already under some kind of supply chain requests, you will start to see the influence of larger customers coming on board and asking questions about your practices and what you're doing. And conversely, if you're doing things and you're doing the right things, that really does open up the opportunities of what you can do with those organisations. And there are some great opportunities if you're good at some of the key and core things that you need to do that open up business opportunities. The final one there is actually, what are your competitors doing? You need to be aware that you're not working in an island, as it were, and just be aware of what key competitors might be doing, so you're not sort of starting to fall behind. Or if you're trying to lead in a particular area, are they sort of creeping up to you, and will that take away some of your competitive advantage? One of the key questions around this is how leadership, whether that's an owner manager or whether that's the board of a listed company, how do they get to what's the balance between the risk, the brand reputation, and the reward and the long-term business resilience over what is some quite complex problems. And depending on the industry that you're in, the geographic footprint, the historical portfolio focus can have a direct bearing on the risk and the proportionality of ESG. So those are the sort of key 6 factors. I would urge everybody that's starting to look at ESG or has been involved in it for some time to look at opportunities and not just the risks. So I'm going to hand over to Mark, but before I hand over to Mark and take questions a little later on, I think that we've got a poll due. So the poll says, when considering the ESG impacts on your business, on balance, do you feel the opportunities outweigh the risk, or the risks outweigh any opportunity? And we'll take a minute just to get responses on that. Good. And the responses are that 77% believe the opportunities outweigh the risks, and only 23 think the risks outweigh any opportunity. So that's good. And I shall hand over to Mark. Thank you.
Hi, and good morning, everybody on the call, and thank you for joining this. Can we just move to the next slide, please? So just while that's moving, I think what's important to establish here is just the differential between what is sustainability and what is ESG. In simple terms, sustainability really is a general term for business that highlights environmental work and everything that is potentially happening with the climate and effectively doing better. Whereas ESG is much more focused upon the reporting mechanisms and the principle behind which business now need to operate. And it's much more smart in the nature of its measure. I think for those of you that also attended the COP or watched it online or got bombarded by the 50,000 sheets worth of commentary that was effectively written for the 2 weeks, it is a fundamental systemic change that business now need to consider this. It is not going away, and this position around net zero, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is here to stay, and businesses now need to get on board with it, really. And I think it was very clear that the volume of people that attended COP and also the amount of business that was there, including the CBI that was there pretty much for the whole 2 weeks, indicates how important that this is. So what I wanted to do, and the whole idea of this webinar, was to cut through some of this, what I call green noise, and some of the confusion that SMEs and mid-cap businesses are actually facing. So as I've said, ESG means different things to different people. I would urge people to go to the specialist, and I will be highlighting this every time, whoever you choose to pick, because there is a lot of, I'd effectively say, unregulated activity, and it's often likened to the Wild West at the moment in terms of advisors. So I'd be very clear and focused around who the people you want to go and talk to. There is a huge amount of acronyms, and I will pull up a slide in a minute with some acronyms on it, but it's acronym overload. And a lot of it is not necessary, and a lot of it you don't necessarily need to know about. You can cut through it again with the right engagement. Ostrich syndrome, and I suppose an element of head in the sand here. I think that is changing, as indicated by the last poll, but I would urge every SME, at whatever level you choose to start looking at this, as Rich outlined, is to actually pull your head out of the sand. This is not going away, and there has been historically quite a lot of people talking about it and saying, oh, it won't affect me. It's affecting all people from the very top in terms of listed entities right the way down to the bottom of the supply chain, and you'll hear people in the food industry particularly talk about upstream, downstream, so it is coming. Greenwashing, I would urge people to ensure that whatever they do, they don't just effectively put an elastoplast over this and do similar to what corporate and social responsibility, CSR, used to be, which was a report that was put on a boardroom shelf and a box ticked. Those days are gone for this. There is a difference between energy compliance and environmental social governance, ESG. Energy compliance is literally complying with a set of key standards, and particularly if you get caught in some of the reporting requirements, whereas environmental social governance is a cross-business approach to changing the way you act. And I think Andrew Carnegie historically said, in order to do good, you need to make money, whereas that's changed now, and this is actually making money by doing good. And I think and there is an important difference there. Cost and loneliness of benefits and corporate timidity, I think, are all still sitting there with some businesses that it doesn't affect me, and how much is it going to cost me, and what is the return I'm going to get. I think as organizations now, big businesses need to move beyond that. It isn't necessarily just about what is the cost. You need to look at the return on investment, and there is clear return on investment if you plan correctly. Next slide, please. So as part of this, the work that we've been doing, and quite heavy in this space, I was dealing with sustainability as far back as 2008, when the organizations that I was dealing with were looking at this, and we were calling it the green agenda, and it was the less work, using less for a more sustainable future, not to be confused with doing less. So SME solutions, adopt the keep it simple principle. With SMEs, we know 92.2% of businesses are SMEs, mainly driven between 0 and 49 employees. A lot of those are family-owned businesses, and actually over 16% of them operate in construction And the other large chunk being scientific, technical activities and professional services, i.e. probably quite a lot of people on this call. And then obviously another 10% in wholesale and retail. They also employ in total circa a significant amount of staffing of 16.3 million with 2.3 trillion pounds in revenue. So this is a big sector for the UK. So how do we deal with this? The first thing that we would say is you need to map your baseline activities. You need to look at everything the company is doing that potentially affects the environment. We call this integrated external engagement. Look at everything that the business is doing externally and map it, as well as looking at all of your internal activities. There are numerous different standards and approaches, and I've just put a few acronyms there. There is a lot out there. We've cut through this and highlighted the ones that we believe are the most important. So SECR, which is Streamline Energy and Carbon Reporting, it only applies to businesses of a particular size, but it does require you to report formally and to report your energy emissions and to do some comparative work and to also look at baselines, charts and trends, also prior year activity as well. The one that may be more relevant is ESOS, which is an environmental standard. Again, it captures businesses with particular turnovers, and we can share all of this afterwards, with businesses with circa 250 staff. And then probably the most important is the Greenhouse Gases Protocol, which outlines 3 scopes. Now that's probably the biggest takeaway I would say of this, which is scope 1, direct emissions, scope 2, which is indirect, and scope 3, which is other indirect. Effectively, scope 1 being those emissions that are controlled by you as a business, from boilers, vehicles, etc. Scope 2 being indirect, which is the stuff you buy, which is basically electricity, heat, steam and cooling. And then scope 3 is effectively everything else, which is much, much harder to measure and subject to quite a lot of discussion and debate at the moment. I think for SMEs, depending on where you fall into, define what scale of development you want to do with ESG. You can do a headline review, make sure you're complying with particular standards, or you can go for a full cross-business engagement where you bring the whole business forward, where you will be doing more good by performing better, or simply just make sure you've got non-financial assurance in place as well. And again, there are lots of standards out there. We tend to use ICAEW standard 3000, which is on governance and assurance. When you decide all of that, and again, working with the right professionals, you need to say, well, that's enough, or do you go the next level? And you'll see references to things like SBTI, which is Science-Based Targets Initiative, and TCFD, which is the panel on financial disclosure, the task force on financial related disclosures. That is the next level up. For SMEs, there is a question whether you need to go that far. It depends on the scale and size of the business. Some of your supply chain may turn around and say, actually, if you want to continue to supply us, you need to do this. And I think that's a really important point that Rich said. This is coming down the track, and for SMEs and mid-cap businesses, you need to look at what they're expecting. As a baseline, businesses that you'll probably be supplying to will be expecting you to at least comply with scope 1 emissions under the Greenhouse Gases Protocol. And again, if you just take that slide away from today, that will give you a sort of route map about what you need to be considering. And I would say, as I said, it is the Wild West out there at the moment, and I would urge businesses to work with a professional team, whatever organization that may be, whether it's consultants, Big 4, top 10, top 20, or a different sector altogether. Work with people who know what they're talking about. Next slide, please. The other big question that you will be thinking and be asking right now is, how much is it going to cost? How much time and resources is it going to impact? I think you have to look at it in a different way. What's the cost of not doing it? And again, adopting the KISS principle, we look at it in three basic ways. Create a basic framework within the business, and no doubt we'll probably talk about some of that in the Q&A. Evaluate what you need to do within the business, and then decide an action plan and implement it. And appoint a leader in the business to lead this, whether that's the CEO, whether that's somebody you bring in. Have somebody to lead it. Some businesses won't have the scale to put a team in, obviously, and it will probably form part of somebody else's responsibilities. But make sure that you're clear about how you want to manage this within the business. Do you want to manage it through environmental, social, and governance principles? Or do you want to manage it through different business strands? What does your turnover look like? Who are the main suppliers? What are their requirements? How much of an impact do they have potentially on your scope 3 emissions? And what are they expecting from you to comply with them? Because remember, your customers will also be having to do this too. So it is an entire one team event, and you must think like that. In terms of return on investment and business, take two organizations. One is doing environmental social governance at a very baseline level, let's say just reporting, and the other one is doing the full kind of entire business integration. Which one's worth more? I'll let you think about that. I think we all know what the decision, what the answer is. You need to think about that. How that is valued at the moment is still being challenged and questioned, but it is a big part of what business is. And if you just click the slide again, please. And what we've balanced there in the seesaw is the difference between business investment and return on investment and environmental social governance. I think the two need to effectively level off. And for mid-cap businesses, mapping out a route map, it doesn't all have to be done immediately, is the most successful and effective way. So I think that gives you a bit of a flavor of where we are with process and approach and keeping it simple and adopting that KISS principle. One clear message that did come out of COP26 is that greenwashing and using things like carbon offsetting and the transparency of that, and references to investment now under terms like green steel, is going to define the way in which business operate certainly over the next decade. And I would urge businesses that haven't thought about this already to start to think about this very seriously. And on that note, I'm going to stop, and I think we have another poll to run. I think that's correct. And then I'm going to hand over to Chris Newnham to give him a perspective from the front end of business. There we go. So in terms of timelines, what do you think the greatest impacts to your business will occur? So when do you think the impacts are going to be most felt? Short term, medium term, or long term? So if everybody wants to vote now, we'll give it a quick minute. There we go. Oh, interesting. So it's quite balanced between the impact being short term and medium term. So depending on the sector, some people may think it will be coming further down the track. It's interesting. Maybe we'll explore that a little bit in the Q&A, particularly around those sectors that think it's going to be more medium term versus those that it's affecting in the short term. Okay, and on that note, running roughly to time, I'm going to hand over to Chris Newnham from Wilkin & Sons. Thank you very much.
Mark, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be with you. What I thought I would do was give you a very quick overview of our business and then talk you through some of the journey that we're on at the moment. Mark touched on the whole greenwashing piece, and that is an absolutely massive concern for us. I think, you know, the most important thing is the authenticity, the integrity that we have with the journey that we're on. We are absolutely not perfect. We've got some interesting stuff going on, but I'll come back and talk to you a little bit more about that. So in terms of our business, Wilkin & Sons, we have been going in our current guise for the last 136 years. We've been manufacturing jams on site since 1885. The Wilkin family have farmed prior to that for about 300 years, and they've been growing fruit on site we've been growing fruit on site for about 160 years. Wilkin & Sons is the holding company under which sits a portfolio of brands, and foremost amongst those is the Tiptree brand, although we have several other jam brands, Thursday Cottage, Jules and Sharpie, that sit under there. We're a more broadly diversified business than we've ever been. We have a chain of 10 tea rooms across Essex and Suffolk. We have a patisserie business, and we have a growing fresh fruit business. So much more broadly diversified than we have been. We have a business that's built on the principles of quality, integrity, independence, and sustainability. Those are the kind of yardstick by which we judge all the decisions that we make. And we are changing in terms of our structure as a business. We still see ourselves very much as a family business, but that family involvement is changing. Peter Wilkin remains an integral part of our business. He's on our board in a non-exec capacity. But having married quite late in life, Peter could see that the writing was likely on the wall for family succession within the business, and set about securing that independence for us in the longer term. And about 30 years ago, cast around and hit upon the employee benefit trust model. So the exemplar that everybody's aware of is the John Lewis model. We are in a similar vein, albeit there's 100 different shades of employee benefit trust. We have just reached the point in the last 3 or 4 years where collectively the staff are now the majority shareholders in our business. So coming on to talk about the sustainability piece, I'm always slightly hesitant to talk about this because it's a journey. We've taken some small steps. We have a view of where we are likely to go to over the next 5 years. And we are very fortunate in that we are a truly vertically integrated business. So we go right the way through from primary production on our farm, and we're farming about 850 acres, through manufacturing, through retail, and actually if you so choose, and I would highly recommend that you do, you can come and consume the end product in one of our tea rooms. So our farm gives us a kind of a unique angle and a unique opportunity as well. Where does the farm stand today? We are a leaf mark farm. That will mean something to some people, I guess not to others. We're also a leaf demonstration farm, and that's about exemplifying best practice in terms of integrated farm management. So we have a lot of our land put into higher level stewardship previously, countryside stewardship today. As I sit here today, we're planting 1.5 kilometers of new hedge. We've got hundreds of hardwoods that we're planting around the farm. It's a good time of year to do stuff like that for us. And we are desperately at the moment trying to understand the whole regenerative agricultural piece, stroke carbon offsetting piece, and how that could apply to us. And that is something that we're struggling with at the moment, because I think it's an evolving area of study, and there's lots of differences of opinion, and trying to filter the information that's out there is really can be quite difficult and quite challenging. So where are we within our factory and our operations? Well, we've recently signed up to the UN Climate Neutral Now pledge, which essentially says that we are on a journey. It's not something that we're talking an awful lot about yet, because I think we would like to get further down the road before we're brave enough to really put our heads above the parapet. We're working with an organization called One Carbon World to measure the extent of all our emissions, and Mark's already referred to the 3 different strands of Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. We've spent a very large part of this year, and in saying this, I recognise the fact that we're fortunate that we've got depth to the team that we have on site, so we've been able to dedicate some resource to it. But it's really taken us a good 9 months to drill down and understand the full extent of our emissions across all of our operations and all of our supply chain. And that's quite a scary number when it comes back at the end of that exercise. And again, I'll come back and talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So we're pursuing opportunities then within our operations to reduce emissions. We've invested in very significantly in the last 4 years in new energy efficient boilers. Our old boilers were 60 years old. They were oil originally. We had converted them to gas, but now we've got new highly energy efficient gas boilers. We've already installed a 100 kilowatts, I beg your pardon, of roof scale solar, with a plan for a field scale install of 1 megawatt of solar in 2022. Planning permission permitting. We're doing a lot of work on water efficiency, so looking at all the opportunities that we possibly can within the business to try and reduce our water usage, and then tying up with the farm. We're uniquely positioned in that all the wastewater that now comes from our factory can be reutilized on our farm to irrigate crops. And again, I appreciate that not many people are in that position. We're doing lots of baby steps within the factory, replacing all our lights with LED lights, driving efficiency within our kit, new pumps, inverters. Another one, I suppose that's an easy win for all of us, is we are purchasing green electricity these days, until such point where we are producing all of our own electricity needs on site. So I think in terms of this journey, I mean, it's very much a question of us having more questions than answers. We've got to start small and start to build as we go along. It's really difficult to filter the noise that's out there. I know that's the title of today's talk. 5 years ago, we were being told about CSR. Today, I hear sustainability is thrown about, ESG is thrown about, SESG, B Corp, and there are other acronyms that are thrown about by people quite happily. They mean very different things to different people, but in my mind, they still boil down to the same thing, which is acting and behaving responsibly. I think that probably gives you enough of an overview at this stage, and I'll hand back to Rich, I think.
Awesome, Richard. Thank you ever so much. Thank you, everyone. What an incredibly stimulating set of presentations. And now, just to remind people, please do put your questions in the Q&A. But we've got one already from AJ, which is, although the ESG agenda cuts across an organisation, which department within an organisation could possibly own and drive the ESG mandate? Well, of course, we're all going to be incredibly biased and say the finance function, but let's not leave it there. What do you think, Rich? Let's go to you first. What do you think?
I think, to be honest, I've seen it owned by many functions, and finance certainly, HR. I've seen a fair proportion from the Marcoms that it's been owned as well. I think the key sort of things are, one, as Mark alluded to, it needs high-level leadership. And then, there's no reason why, if it's a manufacturing organisation, for instance, the operations department shouldn't control it. It's a sort of view of who's got the best resource and the best handle on the sort of streams of activity that are cross-cutting the business, and making sure that there's resource, but you're going to be working across your business. So as long as it's resourced properly and they've got the right knowledge, it doesn't really matter which organisation it is, because the team is going to need to be multidisciplinary.
Yeah, I mean, in truth, it's an exercise in collaboration, isn't it? Because
exactly.
there are so many different aspects to this. But Chris, where does it sit in Wilkin & Sons?
Okay, so I agree with what you're both saying. I think it's cross-functional ultimately. We are fortunate that within our operations team, we have an environmental team. We have two people. It's too grand a thing to call it a team, but we've got people who are specifically focusing on that. I think you've got to have finance on board, because a lot of the decisions that you are making are going to require investment, and we need to bring our FD with us in that respect. And it's got to be led from the top. If we're not enthusiastic and ambassadors for the whole thing, it's not going to happen. But there is also an element, I have to say, maybe uniquely within our business, of it coming from the bottom up as well. We've got a couple of environmental champions, self-appointed, I would say, environmental champions, who are always challenging us on our approach. We do plan, we haven't got electric car chargers in yet. We do plan to put them in, but he's always on our back saying, when are they coming? When are you going to have them ready? And why aren't more of us cycling to work at this point in time? So I think it's cross-functional. It's got to be led from the top, but everybody needs to buy into the whole program.
And I rather love the idea that you have self-appointed environmental champions, because that speaks volumes about your your culture, because that's going to be part of it, isn't it? A culture that gives people permission to champion in that way.
Yep.
And Mark, I mean, you've got experience of, I mean, yeah, across all sorts of sectors. Do you see any common themes in how the governance is arranged?
I've seen it both ways. I've seen it in a sort of CEO capacity when I was doing that, and without a shadow of a doubt, it has to be led from the top. Otherwise, it's a bolt-on, and people will see, well, is it part of my day job, yes or no? And if it's driven, what I've seen is the CEO's office or the operations director put a team together from cross-business support, and drive it that way as a project. So effectively like a project-led function, or indeed somebody's appointed or the responsibility is given at a mid-cap level within the business, if you like, so middle management, and they drive it. So effectively your sustainability leader. In industry, the key players usually are, as Chris alluded to, your operations piece, your engineering piece, your finance piece. That's where traditionally I've seen it start. It's in the manufacturing sector. In practice, which is the world that I live in before and now, I am seeing from the younger generation a upward swell of, well, what are we doing? Can I be part of it? Whereas I said slightly more mature generation is less likely to kind of proactively do that. So I'm seeing, so they're the kind of main themes, but I come back to what I said at the beginning, it has to be top led. And then I think the bottom will start to swell more, but it has to be driven from the very, very top of the business.
Yeah, you've got to have the top giving you the permission.
You've got to want to do it.
Yeah.
You know, otherwise it's just enforced. You've got to want
Yeah.
to do it. And I think, as I said earlier in my piece, what is the opportunity cost of not doing it? Rather than think, well, how much is it going to cost me? How much is it going to cost me not to do it?
Yeah, and I think that's if one was to think of it the other way around, that the kind of signs of it not working are often seeing it as a cost rather than an investment. Quite often when it's fragmented to like little cottage industries going on in different parts, using different frameworks and so on. But and I've got a question that I think kind of connects to that. I think, you know, the purpose, the very good purpose of this webinar is about the green noise, and you know, I imagine many people kind of look at this, sort of think about sustainability, and in fact they're probably overwhelmed by the sort of blizzard of frameworks and acronyms and toolkits and things, and we've had members who say, well, I went onto the web in the internet and Googled a net zero, and an hour later I was more confused than when I started. So thinking about that, what would your words, and let's maybe start with you, Chris, because you know you've got hands-on practice. Is there a place where somebody's thinking, right, where do I begin? Monday morning, I want to start. What would your advice be? Where would you start? What would you use?
I think, I think everything starts with measuring. I think if you can't measure it, sorry, it's a cliche, but if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So you've got to start by measuring, and then you have some baseline from which to judge the decisions that you wish to make going forward. I think also I'm very, very conscious of how overwhelming the whole task can seem. So you've got to break it down. It's the old adage of eating an elephant. You know, you've got to break it down into bite-sized chunks. But accepting the fact that doing nothing is not an option. You know, we've got to have some sort of forward momentum. But it is tough, and I think there's a tendency for us to present it very often as win-wins. That's not a bad thing necessarily, but you know, we will have to make some fairly difficult decisions and fairly fundamental decisions. I'll give you an example, and this comes back to trying to avoid the whole greenwashing piece as well. We've gone through and we've done the audit of our business, and we've established that we're producing tens of thousands of tons of carbon emissions. And actually, there is a solution that's offered to us that says you can pay, you know, tens of thousands of pounds. In our case, it would be probably £25,000, and you can offset all of those emissions by planting trees in Uruguay or Peru, wherever it is now. And at one level, that's quite an attractive proposition. We could then go back to the market and say, hey, we're the first, we're the first carbon neutral jam on the marketplace. But actually, it's fundamentally wrong. That is not what we need to do. We need to address and change behaviors on site so that we're reducing our impact. But to just set that into context, to set that £25,000 to pay to make a problem go away into context, the megawatt of solar that we're looking to install is going to tackle about 50% of our energy needs on site. So it's a very substantial thing. But it's actually, in the context of our emissions, only going to reduce our carbon emissions by about 600 tons against about 14,000 tons of emissions overall. So, it's a really tough nut to crack and an expensive nut to crack at some levels. But I think, there are small things that you can then do, such as changing light bulbs, putting water reducing mechanisms on taps. And, there are small steps that you can take, but it's a journey of 1,000 miles, isn't it?
Yeah. So we've got a couple more questions, and Rich, I'm going to come to you with this one because it nicely follows on from that, and it's from Suresh, who says they own a 1960s office building, and they've changed lights to LED. They practice a bit of recycling, but they found that the rules between different boroughs are so jumbled they just don't think it's effective. And I think there's a bit of a challenge there, isn't there? And you're doing stuff, but your faith in what's going on. But Suresh asks, what steps do you think we as an SME should take next? Which kind of fits with what would you start measuring and what would you measure it with, perhaps?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is, for most SMEs, it's really understanding your own footprint is the starting point. So, and that's, I know we've focused a little bit on the carbon emission side, but that can be in usage of raw materials, for instance, where your waste is, Chris sort of mentioned water and things like that. So the sort of key things from an environment perspective would be, your carbon, your raw material usage, but also when we think of this as ESG, there's the whole social agenda in terms of the amount of hours that staff are working, et cetera, and where they're effective. So my answer to the question actually is very much understanding that the industry that you're in and then working backwards from there. There are some key things that are obvious for all organisations to work on because there is the opportunity to save money if you save carbon, hence energy. Over the longer term, you will likely save money. All those Chris has alluded to, there could be some investment in there. But I think it's working out which your key customers want you to act on. So, as I say, we're focused on climate. It could well be something around labour standards, et cetera, that you actually need to focus on because that's really important to your industry. So I think, and this doesn't have to be an enormous exercise, but really understanding what the customer requirements are, whether that's at a consumer level or whether that's direct customer level, of what's important to your own staff, and then developing the sort of key 4 or 5 things for your customers and your organisation, and set your baseline as we've already talked about, and then monitor that. The only other proviso I would put on that is make it sure it's something that you can influence. This is a huge subject matter if you explore all its eventualities, and there are some key things here. One, sometimes you have to work within your industry because that's the only way you'll sort of shift the paradigm. And secondly, try not to get too far involved in something that you simply don't have the power to influence. You've got to sometimes work with others and then decide what you can influence and where you want to lead and focus down on that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So with Suresh, I noticed that he says they own a 1960s office building. So probably after replacing the LED, I would say it's things like how look at the insulation of the building, thinking about, we're going to see increasingly hot summers. So, a building built in the 1960s, thinking about how many days at 30 degrees can it withstand and what's it like for people working in that, and then the loss of heat, which is going to cost you money during the winters. But You're on the journey, Suresh, and that looks great. Mark, you were going to add something.
Rich, I was just going to add, yeah, picking up really on Rich Hall's point about environmental social governance. It isn't all just about emissions and what are we doing from a green perspective. Social and governance is also about how a company is run, how its ethics are, and Chris touched on this a little bit. What are the ethics of the business? Are we making money to do good, or are we doing good by making money correctly? And I think that's the difference between ESG and CSR. And I think we've got to be really clear about that. Some customers, beg your pardon, of companies may turn around and talk about waste. They want to have a real focus on that. Their supply chain is managing their waste more effectively. Now that not necessarily may just be about pollution. That may well be simply about recycling and looking at what their burn rate is within a business, which also then affects margins. I'm talking about the food industry here because it's a sector I spend quite a lot of time in. Equally, they might want to talk about gender balance and training and bringing in additional personnel to future-proof the industry, which is more of the social and the governance perspective. Big suppliers and customers have almost a duty of care within ESG now to support their industries, not just to make heaps of cash. So it's more than what I was saying earlier about frameworks. And I would add as well, when Rich talked about measurement, you both did, look at the legality. What do you legally have to do? What is your baseline starting point as businesses? Because some of you may get caught by ESOS, depending on the number, particularly volume of temporary staff, which get registered when you do your company's house returns, etc. You might get caught out in particular standards. And as I said, it is cascading down the chain from listed right the way down to SME. So it's just really think about it more strategically than simply, can I cut my emissions? I think I said in my slide, you know, you could just go down that route, that's fine, but that's not ESG. That's just reducing your emissions and recording it. That's scope one. That's not ESG. So I think it's an important distinction.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then there's a sort of point of opportunity here, isn't there? Because if you, as a small or medium-sized business in somebody's supply chain, you know, already can demonstrate good practice with employees, can already demonstrate good environmental practice, you know, these are companies that are going to be forced to report their emissions, their work practice and so on, and they're going to want that information from their supply chain. So that could well put you in a favoured status. I'm going to move on to a question now from Elizabeth, and I love questions like this because it starts with Elizabeth was saying she absolutely loves Tiptree jam. Don't we all, actually? I was delighted when I saw that this was going to be the one. And isn't it good to know that eating Tiptree jam is good? But she's interested to know how you best share with your customers your progress to date and what your environmental plans are for the future and how this ties in with your marketing plans.
Okay, that's an excellent question. Thank you. And thank you for the shout out, Elizabeth. Appreciate that. I think I said at the outset that one of our principles is that of integrity. There is a lot of good work that we've started on site, I think, already. Having said all of that, we have an awfully long way to go. We could, I suppose, if we so choose, go and make a great song and dance about where we are currently. But I think we want to be absolutely authentic with what we're doing. Now, we've done, I mentioned the One Carbon World piece that we've done, where we've done a whole business audit to understand from not just from the Tiptree point of view, but from all our subsidiaries and our farms point of view, what our total emissions are. The other piece of work that we are getting involved with is a program called Agri-Capture, and that's to do with understanding what the opportunities are with effectively utilizing our estate to offset many of our emissions. So we've got to develop and continue to generate best practice within our operations, but also we have to use our estate to best effect. We don't understand that piece at this point in time, so there's still another chunk of work that I want to see us complete before we can mesh the two together and get a holistic view of how our business or where our business is going to sit in 5 years' time. So until we can do that and have absolute authenticity with what we're doing, I think we will continue to hide our light under a bushel for the time being.
Terrific. I I've got another question now, which is it's a sort of what do we think is coming up, and I suppose just starting with COP26, I suppose COP26 kind of delivered less than we'd hoped for and more than we expected. But one of the commitments there was to go away and think about ratcheting up and targets between now and 2050, so that we don't get to 2049 and go, oh, yes, next year we've got to come up with some cuts in emissions. So we're probably in the UK going to see quite a lot more regulation, particularly around carbon coming out and regulatory pressures. What do you think, guys? What do you think? Start with you, Mark. What do you think is coming up in the next year or two? And maybe that sort of fills out a bit of it'd be interesting to think about whether that's the short-term impacts people are thinking about.
Well, the immediate one with my sort of food and farming hat on was, I think it was on day 3 or day 4, was the emissions pledge around methane. To sign up to, I think it was to cut methane emissions by 30% over the next 10 years. And I imagine that will ratchet up a little bit quicker. So I think there's going to be some fairly big noises coming out so I've just put my food and farming hat on there. I think for me, what's coming down the track, businesses are now understanding that this is not a kind of nice to have. This is the way business is now going to operate. And you only need to look at the listing of Deliveroo on the stock market in the UK. I can't remember, about 6 months ago now. And they priced it at a particular level. On day 1, it dropped significantly, about 25, 30%. Reason why it dropped is their ESG profile in their prospectus was not robust enough. It was just waffle and didn't have specific targets, measurability, and they weren't committed enough to it. And that was a big reaction from the markets to say, not really good enough, guys. So I think there's going to be a shift to do more at listed level. And as a result of that, I think there's going to be more expectation for things to be checked and audited, if you like. I think there's going to be greater pressure on the profession to get their act together, to make sure that it's clear that we can actually give opinion and, well, when I say opinion, feel satisfied that what is written in reports is robust. And I think there's a big training, Richard can talk about that as well, I think a big training piece around that. I also think there's going to be more question about integrity of certain things. So when you talk about carbon capture and offsetting, how that actually works, and the actually transparency and genuine approach to carbon offsetting rather than simply ticks and boxes, the integrity of that. I also think there's going to be greater focus on capital development, talking about things like green steel and looking at how investment for big buildings is underpinned at the very base level in terms of where the procurement is coming from. So they're just a couple of things that I think are going to come down more and more on track. But I guess my final point is reporting levels, I think, will cascade down. TCFD have done a lot of work around all of that. Sorry, Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, for the people who are thinking yet another acronym, are coming down the track. And I think that there'll be some more legislation on that, which can expect mid-cap to start doing more in their members' reports and more forward. And I'll also say as well, I think business might start to be a bit more proactive about it. I think, well, I haven't looked at Wilkins & Sons annual accounts, but I'm sure that the disclosure levels in there will start to grow because investors and people will start to look at this sort of thing. And I come back to what I said before. Is the business more valuable with all of this in it or not in it?
Yeah. And I guess that looking at the Green Finance Roadmap and the sustainability disclosure requirements that the UK government put out has made it clear that they'll use the framework of the International Sustainability Standards Board as the backbone of what they do, but they're very clear they're going to go beyond that and require businesses to talk about their impact. Now that opens the door because the financial report, of course, only talks about materiality in relation to financial disclosures and shareholders. And impact, of course, assumes a much wider range of stakeholders. So we not only sort of seeing the depth of reporting, but also the breadth, perhaps. Rich,
there's money out there, Richard, as well. They just said there's money out there now. So the government launched a new fund in agri-food and farming, 27 million last week. It's about being innovative and accessing the cash.
Yeah. So, Rich, we've got another question, which I think you might be able to answer. Steve is asking, what's your view on offsetting? And do you recommend, recommend any organisations to support it?
So I think, I mean, I share some nervousness that everybody has spoken about today. And, in the past, offsetting has had some bad reputations and some bad practice, quite frankly. But I absolutely, when you look at, you know, a net carbon zero society without some form of offsetting is impossible on the current trajectory. And, you know, when you look at net carbon zero targets, they assume that there will be offsetting for industries that can't get there. So and one of the things that came out of COP26 obviously was that there will be a global standard around offset markets. So, you know, we look forward to that. I think it's needed. So having said all of that, I'd sort of probably reiterate what Chris said at the outset. You need to do as much as you can, and once you've done that, I think that's when offsetting has its place, and that's, you know, that's within the SB, the science-based target initiatives. It accepts things like that. At the moment, it's the kind of gold standards that you would want to look for. I wouldn't want to recommend a sort of specific organisation, but certainly look for the gold standards and the certified offsets. And then the other thing is here, there's obviously there's a question about the value for money aspect for it, but there's an alignment to, is it something that you can do? For instance, is there a UK one if you want to invest back into the UK economy, or if, for instance, you had produce from, say, West Africa, do you want to do an offset in West Africa? So because that's where it's important that some of your produce comes from. So there's a sort of question of what's the validity and certifiability of the offset? Is it and transparent and robustness? That's absolutely key if you do it. Then you've got to start to think about, where do you want that offset, which part of the world? Obviously, we're going to have technology offsets coming in soon with things like carbon capture and storage. And then sort of finally, there's this sort of what the value for money aspect. And bear in mind that offsets work by surrendering, so you will need to be buying offsets every single year as well, so to offset your greenhouse gas emissions on a yearly basis.
Yeah, and certainly at ICAEW, when we started our journey, we recognised that we were going to buy offsets, but as part of the process, not as a goal, and made sure that those offsets had additionality in their value. So water projects in Cambodia, biomass projects in Southeast Asia, and forest restoration in Africa. Chris, you were going to add something.
No, I was just going to say that it comes back to the, what concerns us with it is coming back to the authenticity piece. It feels a little bit like the Wild West out there at the moment, and we don't understand enough, which is why we want to understand what our opportunities are within our own estate to do some genuine offsetting. And I may have got these numbers wrong, and there's Rich and Mark will be able to correct me, I'm sure. But if we want to offset a ton of carbon at the moment through planting trees in South America, I think we can do that for about £4 a ton. I'm not sure that the UK market has found its level yet, but my understanding is that to offset a ton of carbon back here, it's potentially got a value of about £50–60 a ton. I just can't get my head around that. Why is that differential there when the end result amounts to the same thing?
And we're at that cliffhanger. We are at time.
Did you notice how we all went very quiet at that point?
Tune in for the next series. I mean, that is the dilemma. A global price of carbon is indeed one of the big challenges of our time. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it. Everyone on tenterhooks, my thanks to you, the audience, for tuning in and your questions. And my thanks and appreciation to our panelists, Mark, Chris and Rich. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Cheers now.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.